Kia ora koutou, I'm Howard Youngs, and I'm a senior lecturer at AUT and formerly was at Unitec. So I've been involved in postgraduate education, particularly in the area of educational leadership and management, for about the last 11 years now. And prior to that, involved in pre-service teacher education, primary and secondary, and prior to that, secondary deputy principal maths teacher. So I've been around in education for a number of years now and love it. So one of the things I'm just going to do here is go over, it's not quite a replication, but I did a presentation here to a cluster of schools in East and South Auckland just recently. And in that I've taken deliberately maybe a different slant or a different approach. In these times we hear a lot, say, of meta-analysis and how these meta-analyses are meant to guide and basically say these are the things you should be doing. I think, yes, they have their place, but at the same time we need to have a look at look through other frames as well. Because then I think it gives us an even deeper, more contextualised local understanding of practice, and also the challenges and opportunities of transferring good practice from one place to another. And for that we need to be drawing on areas like sociology, not leadership. And so sometimes to really understand good leadership practice, sometimes it's good not to start with leadership. And then to take our focus into practice, and then to say, well, out of that practice, sometimes we label parts of that as being leadership. And you notice it's a different way around of doing it. And also what it does is it then repositions everybody in education as equal professionals, which I think is the heart of a lot of leaders I meet, or those in leadership roles. So one of the key words I'm going to be picking up on is the conditions. The local conditions within a school, and also the conditions maybe between schools as well if they're working in networks. And rather than leaders and followers and goals, which is the standard ontology, not just for educational leadership, not just New Zealand education policy, but this is leadership field in general. And there are arguments out there, and very good ones, saying that if we only focus in terms of leading, following, and goals, it's actually a very narrow way of interpreting practice and understanding it. And that's coming from the general leadership field, not just educational leadership, not just New Zealand. So if we look at other alternatives like influence and forms of capital that we have, or mana, there are different terms that we could use to help kind of peel behind or peel back what happens in practice. And I'm going to touch on a couple of bits about individual and collective learning. And when I talk about this type of learning here, I'm talking about adult learning. I'm not talking about student achievement. And actually, I think a better word than student achievement is the learning that a child actually experiences. Everything's so datified that I think the emphasis goes off sometimes the essence of the individual child learning individually and collectively. Here's the key thing about conditions. One of these things here, notice here I didn't say leaders are appointed. I said professional educators are appointed. I've been quite careful with my words there. To roles associated with the term leader. Because if we go back 20 years, it would be associated with the term manager. Leader and leadership's just the sexy term in these days around the world. Okay, you're expected to play a key and probing role in helping shape the conditions for collaborative inquiry into learning and teaching. Not actually have to do it, but it's more about creating the conditions that others can do it collectively, including yourselves. So it's important that the leader does not carry all that responsibility. Now that does have a little implication in terms of the IES, because we need to ask the question, if somebody is coming from one school into a network of other schools or into a community of other schools, what is the expectation being placed on that person in terms of that sort of responsibility? Knowing that, I was thinking last night about this morning, I'll put it this way, like for instance, good principals working with good teachers make the principal look excellent. Okay? So if you take an excellent looking principal who's working with really good teachers and they get transferred out, they're now a good principal again, not an excellent one, because they haven't yet re-established the relationships and connected with the knowledge that exists already within that staff that they're coming over to. So in a way, they're going to have time to build that again. And that time is going to take more than 2 years. And I'm deliberate in saying more than 2 years to see real deep change occur. So, and the other thing here is that when we talk about transferring of knowledge or transferring of expertise within our schools or from school to school or across a network of schools, that we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. And I'm going to unpack that from two different ways this morning. So moving on in terms of history, have a think about this. In your own schools, what patterns of practice have stood the test of time? And I don't just mean good practice. Then ask yourself this question: would that be easily transferable, that pattern of practice, from this place to another place? And I suppose then, but would the process be different from place to place? And even in the same place, you know, when you talk about decision-making process, you may be able to think of times where we went through a season where we made decisions on the spur of the moment. And then we moved into a season where we were far more structured in our decision-making. You know, and so even within one school, we can go through different seasons where the culture changes and the processes change. I want to get on to this word influence here, because I think when we have a look at the word influence, we actually we start to get closer to day-to-day practice than using the leaders, followers, goals ontology. So have a think about, here's you go off into a setting and you're going, I'm quite happy for that person to influence me. Why would that be so?
They've got money. They've got, you know, they're doing it, they're living it.
Okay, so they're doing what they say?
Yeah.
And would that be established over a period of time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Usually their core values line up because, you know, if they're doing it for children,
and they do own up to mistakes, and that's fine, they can do that. Yeah.
Okay, so if you see somebody else owning up to mistakes, that you're more likely to say, the next time you come and speak to me, I'm more likely to have myself being open to being influenced by you.
I'm far more open to be influenced by people with quality communication skills.
Right. Okay, now the next question. See, I'm bringing a separation here. And one way of kind of unpacking it is, if you have a look at this here, here's a role that usually in these days is called a leadership role, whether it's principal or syndicate leader or whatever. And you have this person over here, okay, who says, look, I'm happy to be influenced by these people if they do these sort of things. But then there's people looking on at this person here saying, I'm happy to be influenced by you if. Okay, now that's irrespective of them being in that role. But as soon as they get appointed into this role actually has a whole lot of authority based into it, and it's got a whole lot of, we'll put it this way, we can say, how do we steward this authority that's in here? There's a whole lot of capital built into that role. And what we tend to do is merge the person with the role and say, there's a really good leader, or very strong leader. Whereas, what we're doing is, dropping out microphone, what we're doing is actually maybe confusing two things together. It doesn't help us understand good practice. So, because you see, if a person kind of lacks or doesn't quite have that doesn't have that critical mass of people around them who are saying, I'm happy to be influenced by them, they're more than likely then to try and get influence. They're more than likely to go to their authority that's in their role and use that and tell people. And assume that, hey, being principal or being deputy principal or whatever is sufficient for me to bring about change and ask people to do things. Whereas this other one about saying, hey, how do people actually see me, and are they happy to be influenced by who I am, not from my role? The same thing happens in organisations at the group level. So you could actually have, you can maybe think of, say, 1 year level or one group of staff. Now, I'm going to take this in two different ways. One is take a structural group of staff. So that's the team, like a syndicate team. But then you've got groups of staff which have got no kind of structural kind of basis to them whatsoever. And those groups can sometimes have more influence than other groups. And it changes from school to school. Now those ebbs and flows of how much influence those groups and teams have changes over time, depending on people coming and going, and also as people develop their skills and knowledge. And sometimes a crisis can change people's perceptions of a group as well. Now, I'm just going to biff out a very quick example here. In some of my own research, I deliberately put myself back into, it was in secondary schools, but I deliberately put myself into these schools for 2 years because I wanted to see the ebbs and flows of a change of practice. And I said to them, look, you come up with the context where you'd like me as the researcher to come in and observe. So they had a sense of ownership in that. They both came up with exactly the same context. 2 initiatives that were basically exactly the same. But when you drill down to see how they initiated the 2 projects, they were totally different because the capital associated with different groups in the school were totally different. So you couldn't go and say, hey, if you want to do this, schools, this is how it worked in this school, this is how you should do it. You're going to hit the wall of resistance somewhere along the line. All right? Because the social cultural aspect says, hey, what's the history of these groups over time and how has that changed? And both schools were successful in doing what they needed to implement, but totally different. This is what sits behind it. So I've talked about what's in the chair here, this authoritative capital. And then we've got these other forms, and these are, look, I have seen other words used, like Andy Hargraves is now using professional capital. But we just got to be careful that we don't bang too many popular words in front of the word capital as we do for leadership. I have drawn a bit on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and human capital as skills, cultural capital. Now, when we talk about cultural practices, we're talking about cultural practice associated with different ethnic groups and cultural practices within your own organisational culture. It's both, okay? And when we talk about cultural capital, we're talking about adults here, but remember that your organisational culture is made up a lot by the majority group in your organisation. Who's the majority group in your organisation? The children. And yet we overlook that as them shaping the culture and being the culture. So there's some different ways of kind of peeling back, and that can help us understand why influence works or not, because let's go to the next slide and I'll show you how. When we talk about how much capital do you think you have actually acquired, think of an initiative that's happening in your school that you're part of. And your team that you're part of, have a think of this now. How much capital do you think that team have acquired? Now you see I used the word acquired, not assumed. See, acquired is the capital that you have acquired from the viewpoint of other people. Okay, if people assume that their team has got all the capital and yes, people will just do as we tell them to, again, it might lead to some issues that we're going to have to work through and have some good productive conversations with other people. But it's always good to check and look out and say, how do people perceive us? And just not assume that how we see ourselves is the same as how others see us. And again, I mean, that could be taken within a structural perspective, a senior leadership team, to the staff. It can also be taken in terms of Māori staff, with non-Māori staff. It's, there's many ways you can actually cut that cake and look at it. So when you think about a group or a team who are facilitating a collaborative inquiry or initiative within your school this year, have a think about how much capital do you think others perceive that they have? Because if they're struggling getting it off the ground, that might be one of the issues behind. I'll just say one of the issues behind it. Or if it's really humming along, it might be because people are looking at that group and saying, hey, that's great, because that group has a reputation of getting things done and they're doing it for the children and they're learning. Okay? And it just helps understand why it's happening. Instead of saying, oh, it's because of these leadership practices. See, I haven't used leadership to explain that. I mean, leadership has its place, but this actually helps unpack it a bit further. It's like having this flip side. You hear the term flip learning. Well, we've also got to look at flip reflection and flip leadership. And flip leadership is actually asking this, or flipped influence, is actually looking at how do other staff, and in terms of the IES, or networks, how do other schools see your school as well, in terms of capital, individually and collectively. And that's a really important question to ask now and then. So when I talked about flipping, be wary of using the resistance word too early. Because sometimes the resistance, what we label as being resistance, is sometimes a lack of build-up of the acquirance of capital from other people. And we're saying, oh, we're not getting on board. Oh, these schools aren't getting on board. Build up the capital first in the relationship, whether it's at the system level, at the network school level, or within the school and school community level. And so when we perceive that there's a bit of resistance and a bit of blockage, instead of trying to bash against that and label people as being resistant, first of all, use it to run up and flip over and to ask that question. Okay, so it's flipping and looking back at ourselves. And we can't do that unless we engage with others and actually ask them. How do we come across when we did that project last year in terms of process? So, resistance, if we do use the word, is always a two-way street. And those of us who will say they are being resistant, we've also just got to be aware, and I've put my foot on it myself in doing this, where I realise, oh gosh, I'm actually contributing to the resistance with my style, or the way that I engaged, or with the process I used. I actually contributed to it. And as a leader, I need to take ownership of that. And taking that pathway of humility is another way of actually helping deal with resistance, realising that we're all a bit complicit here. And it's not a them and us, which again speaks against leaders and followers. Because the leader-follower construct works very well, because what it does is it seems to place more of the power with leaders. But if we're really wanting to have this democratic and more of this equal power across our school communities, then we've got to be careful about what sort of words we use and unpack that. So I look at it this way. If you are in a position of leadership, in terms of power, one of our roles is to say, where are people struggling to access the power that they have a right to? And then how can we help them access that power they have a right to? So it's not me or the leader coming over and say, how can I empower you? No, because I can't empower you with what I've got. I need to help remove the obstacles so you can access the power that is yours. See how that's a bit different? For some people, using the word empowerment can be belittling. Not in all cases, but in some ways it can be. So, in terms of learning, and this is the adult part of learning, sometimes we do engage with barriers at the individual interpersonal level, in ourselves intrapersonally, but also in collectives. All of you must be aware of open to learning conversations, maybe dealing with leadership dilemmas. I've just mentioned Viviane's work, I've just mentioned Carol Cardno's work, and that stuff's out there and it's really important. But beneath all of that type of work that gets promoted is Chris Argyris and Donald Schon's work of what's Theory 1 and Theory 2. So as when we do engage in our learning, are we engaging at Model 1 or with Model 2? And here's Model 1 with our defensive norms and our Model 2 of learning-oriented norms. And I generally find, I'm making an assumption, a bit of a generalisation here, people who can move in this area here are happier in their own skin. And they're also happy to be challenged. They have a sense of humility, where humility is often the door that is the open door to learning. But they are also prepared to have some strong resolve as well at the same time. Not just to say it as it is, but to say it productively and not give cloaked messages. So I'm not going to go into that in any more detail, but that's at the individual level. And we're going to be looking at ourselves in terms of our own development and learning. The learning also occurs within teams and groups, and there's barriers that can occur there. So here's a question for you. Think of the team that you work with or a group you work with, and what are some of the learning barriers amongst the adults collectively? This is not individually, this is collectively. And remember, how you see yourselves within that group might be a little bit different from people external to your group looking on. I'll take it to a more system level. There might be learning barriers amongst the staff in a school, and you've got other schools looking on, and they'll have a perception as well. Or if we take a part of the IAS context, we're talking about somebody coming from over here into this place here where there's other kind of barriers with adult learning taking place, and this person is coming in here And the assumption is they're going to be able to get in touch with that straight away. But you see, they have to build up the capital with this group here first to be able to really understand what's happening. That takes more than 2 years, if we want to talk about deep change. All right, that's, I mean, even some of the stuff by, like Hargraves and Fullen and that, will just say, look, we've got to be in this for the long run. And so any initiatives we get involved in, whether it be local or at the system level, we've got to be prepared for the long run stuff. And that has to be shaped in terms of resourcing around contracts, around plans, and around the expectations. We can't have short-term thinking when we're dealing with long-term issues, or issues that take a long term to actually bring about deep change. So in here, some of these things, you might have looked down through some of them and you might be going, I know a team where we had that. I mean, it's real stuff, isn't it? This is what we experience at times. I mean, how many here have you ever experienced somebody who's been a social loafer? Yeah. And sometimes you've been part of a team and people are saying, hey, we've got to work through all of this stuff here and get all our conflicts sorted, but we can spend too much time doing that, we lose our sight of what we're really there for. And so there's a balance in there, isn't it? See, working with groups takes a very special sort of person, I'm not going to say lead, but to facilitate the other adults in terms of group learning. It takes a bit like, and if you want to take a sports example, a captain. So you might have a head of a syndicate, or you might have a principal working with a senior leadership team. But instead, you can't be like, I'm the head of this team. You don't hear Richie McCaw saying that, or Brendan McCullen saying that at the moment. They are setting an example, but they're there like as team captain to make sure the team works really, really well, and the relationships amongst the team members are really good. That's their focus. And then it's the team that becomes effective, which then gets reflected in being an effective school, which then the press pick up and say, wow, there's an amazing principal there. But you know that it's not an amazing principal there. You know that it's an amazing collective of adults working together, and you've had the privilege of working with them. But you do have a skill set in terms of bringing the best out of other people. But that's taken time. In terms of your own schools, or if any of you are starting to work in collectives and networks with other schools, what are some of those potential hooks that sit beneath the surface? Have they been, are you allowing them to rise up and to have them openly out on the table? If you're involved in some sort of collaborative inquiry within your schools this year, are you aware about what some of these hooks are in terms of adult learning for individual staff, but also collectives of staff? Because you see, that's where we need to be putting our focus. Because if we can maximise people working together, well then the children really do benefit. When we are in a senior leadership position, one of the things that we need to make sure we don't lose sight of is that some staff might be in a double bind with us. You see, somebody around you in your staff or a group in your staff might be hesitant to talk about a concern they have with somebody in your senior leadership team. Now, here's the reason possibly why. And it's basically no one's fault. This stuff just happens in organisations. See, in the senior leadership team, over years, if they've allowed a certain type of practice just to carry on unnoticed or just quietly put underneath the carpet, and then you forget that you're actually doing it now, and it just happens because it's now part of the culture, and you've got a new staff member coming in and saying, oh, I have a concern, but hang on, if I talk to the principal about that, well then I'm revealing a cover-up in the senior leadership team. I'm therefore in a double bind, so I won't speak anything about it. Do you understand where I'm coming from in that? I'm not implying that it's there, but when we're in these positions of senior leadership or we're going from one school into another, we need to be so aware of that we're not creating double binds for other people. That's the difference between being a senior leader or someone who's transferring as a senior leader into another place to help other schools and someone who's a middle leader. Okay? There is a distinct difference in there. We've got to be careful that we don't create conditions for a double bind. It means within our own team that, boy, we are really having things out in the open. and we're just got to be careful, because what we do there is we actually damage our profession when that happens. So beware of the double bind. And if we become really skilled at being aware of this, what happens is media and society's perspective of us as a profession goes up. So just be careful of it, be on your watch for it. But again, that has implications, as I said, when somebody goes from one school into another group of schools, because they won't have that local knowledge. So we needed to, okay, how can we help facilitate that? So keep open accounts with each other, and here's the key thing down the bottom here for your team and also for your school, is how are you being seen through other eyes? And not just think about it in terms of one homogenous group through other eyes. Think about the different subgroups that are around. And if somebody's coming from a very strong sense of awhiatanga and whanaungatanga, what are they thinking, or that group is thinking, as they're looking on at you, for instance? You know, so it's not just other eyes, it's also understanding some of the cultural values that behind the other eyes as well is really important. It's not a one size fits all. And that's where it's important we don't say Māori and we don't say Pacific Island or Pacifica, because you see there's many different views within Māori and within Pacifica as well. So where to from here? If you're involved in some collaborative inquiry within your schools this year, a key thing is who's being involved, how and when. So have you gone through really carefully and saying, who has the expertise? Who is this relevant for? Okay, and can we trust them to bring the best that they can into this? So when you are engaging with other people, there are some tests you put in there, and also do the test of saying, who could really be grown in this opportunity? And when we say, can we use our inquiry model process just to focus on how we learn as adults, what I'm putting the challenge out there is saying, when we use inquiry-based learning, the focus is all on, okay, collaborative amongst the teachers for the benefit of the children. But how about if we also build a dual purpose in there and said, how do we do inquiry learning as adults? That goes back to that Model 1 and Model 2 and addressing things like the double bind, because we need to be embracing that as well, okay, in terms of our own development. The last point I want to make here before my last slide is this here. If you are looking about different collaborative inquiries and looking at different initiatives that you're bringing on board within the school, there's two key questions to ask at a school-wide level. And if you're working in a network of schools, here, these questions can be asked as well. Number one, do a test of capacity. What is the capacity of the staff at this current time to take on board a new initiative? Even if it's one of the best initiatives in the world, if they don't have the capacity, it won't be the initiative's fault, it's just that they don't have the capacity at this time and place to really get fully into it. And the test of culture. In other words, what is the culture of this place? How has it shifted over the years, and what are the subcultures in it? As I said earlier, what groups have a reputation for getting things done and which groups don't? And it will change from school to school. And as I said earlier, it will change within a school over time as well. And so when you do have, sometimes an organisation can suffer if it has too many new people come in at the same time, because the institutional memory is lost. Okay, and that's an important thing for us to remember. Some concluding thoughts, and I'll put this back up to the system level. 3 different research projects. For my own one, an initiative that works in one school. Now the initiative could be exactly the same in another school, but the implementation process most probably will not be the same because of the different forms of capital that exist within a staff and the history of that staff. The two schools here that come to my mind straight away is one school said, we've got a collective group already in place, a structural group, a team, and they had a reputation for getting things done, so they did the initiative. In the other school, that same group did not have that same amount of capital, but there was individuals across the school who had a reputation for getting things done, so they came together as a new quasi-group. And the staff were happy for that to happen in both places. Totally different approaches. So if you're a new leader going into a place, unless you have that social cultural understanding and the history of the place, things could get fouled up, or you meet resistance when you didn't have to. The next one down here is some work by Tim Hallett, a sociologist in the States. This leader got appointed to a school in Chicago, and I tell you what, they ticked the boxes perfectly from the board's perspective. Qualifications, training, experience, and also alignment with what the board were wanting to do in terms of policy implementation. But you know, after 6 months, the staff were basically ready to walk out. But the principal ticked all the boxes. Okay, what they didn't do was just give themselves time to establish these social cultural connections. A deputy principal then came in who just focused on building relationships, and then things started to change. But again, that has implementations, especially if somebody goes in with a contract for 2 years to do some turnaround. We've got to be careful they're not getting set up to be hammered because things don't happen quickly. This last one down here, so Christopher Chapman's got a really good article on there about the chains of schools and academies, and he talks about system leadership. But he draws on this other work by Lindsay, and this is what he says. When you have a network of principals working together, there was just a little warning came in. The principals are working brilliantly across their network, but what it did in a couple of places is it led to a decrease in leadership distribution among staff within their schools. You know, so it's far more complex at times than maybe is we're led to believe. And it's on that point there where I'd like to finish. It's far more complex at times than what we're led to believe. Thanks very much.